Welcome to this issue of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. It should come as no surprise that to live in this new environment of COVID-19 or the coronavirus, everybody is having to come up with remote solutions to communicate, to make sure that they're still able to get many of their points across. And Inside America's Boardrooms is no different. For the next certainly 6 to 8 weeks, we're going to try and focus on the issues that boards are experiencing today with the COVID-19 crisis, and also take a look at the top issues that should be on every board's radar. So we call this session and the sessions going forward, Board Leadership and Oversight Challenges within the COVID-19 crisis. And joining me to kick this off is somebody that's a familiar face on the show, but it gives me some comfort that we're still able to communicate together, is Paula Loop, who's the leader of PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome, Paula.
Hi, TK. So nice to see you.
Yeah, again, unprecedented times. As far as companies and certainly as far as boards go, we would hope that all the boards that have been experiencing this, which is all industries, that they had given prior to this crisis some thought to a crisis plan. Today, they're having to do, some serious risk management and obviously more unique communications, just like we're doing today. I assume that's the same thing you guys are experiencing at the center.
Yes, absolutely. I think the interesting thing about this crisis is, a lot of companies have gone through a crisis. Many companies and boards have done crisis management planning, but I don't know that anybody thought that the crisis would affect everything. People that had a cyber attack or they had a geographic regional crisis because of weather or, tornado, hurricane, what have you. So there's been different pockets of crises that companies have dealt with, but this one, COVID-19 really runs the gamut. And so I think it's affecting companies in ways they never imagined. It's affecting the entire company, and there is a lot to do. Management teams are incredibly stretched right now, and boards are, really struggling to get their arms around it.
Yeah, no surprise. And communications and all of the processes, that come with a crisis plan, particularly the challenge of workforce in this case. But this is the perfect example of a black swan event, that there's no way that in the beginning of the year you ever thought you would have to plan for, or the issues that this presents that you'd ever have to deal with. So with that thought, which isn't a terribly pleasant one, but with that thought, let's talk about some of the issues that we got to make sure are on board's radar. And then in the coming weeks, we'll make sure that we dig a little deeper into some of these so that we can offer some meaningful advice about how they might approach some of these issues. So I'll let you, this reminds me of our end of the year where we go back and forth, but it's a good format for this, and I'll let you start with the first issue.
Sure. So, one thing I do want to add to your comment about communications, one thing I'm seeing from, just as a consumer, you're hearing from so many companies, either if you're an employee or, as I mentioned, a consumer as a customer. So communications all the way around, I think, has been really important in this crisis. And since we're still in the crisis mode and it's going to go on for I don't know how long, I think having a long-term communication plan has been really important. So I continue to focus on that. I guess the next thing, so the key that we probably need to talk about and get to pretty quickly is the financial impacts of this, right? Liquidity, issues and cash management, I think, are really where companies had to go a couple of weeks ago and are still in that mode right now. So there's a lot of focus around developing some kind of a cash forecast based on what a lot of scenario planning, and just thinking about how can we survive during this crisis and for how long, doing the things we're doing and given the restrictions that we have in our business. So I think financial planning is a really important part to start with. The other thing I don't want to forget to mention is that it's going to be a really busy first quarter for calendar year end companies, first quarter, or even if you have a fiscal year end and you're trying to report, but a really busy time for audit committees. Lots of topics on their plate, things that companies haven't been used to dealing with for some time. So things like impairments, I mentioned liquidity, going concern assessments, valuations, taking a fresh look at judgments and estimates. So audit committees really ought to be setting aside additional time and probably focusing more on making sure that they are aligned early in the process with management, with their external auditors, and it'll be a really challenging financial reporting period for the next couple of months, I think.
Yeah, I can't imagine, particularly those companies that might have been struggling a little bit with the disruption, in their business, and all of a sudden they have this liquidity issue potential. Um, eh, that certainly can, is doesn't help the weak, at this
No,
point. And we hear this expression of a death spiral where somebody's, liquidity starts to become an issue, and they haven't set up, liquidity relationships, and all of a sudden you enter that death spiral, which is very, very difficult to get out of. And the other thing that immediately came to my mind is dividends.
yes,
Okay, because you're going to see situation where there's companies that have unbelievably long track records of providing dividends that, depending on how long this goes and what the scenarios are, managements and boards are going to be faced with the decision of what do we do, relative to that in this unique environment.
yep. Along with cost cutting, discretionary costs, other costs, we've seen CEOs take pay cuts. We've seen a lot. So there are a lot of things out there that need to be considered, and I think it's going to keep boards quite busy for a while.
Yeah. So the thing I wanted to start with is board operations. There's unfortunately there's still boards out there or individual directors that use their personal email to communicate, um, board and company business. And I'm going to take this moment to get on my soapbox that it really is, being foolish to use personal email that can be hacked, um, on issues that are of utmost importance or need to be secure, in these discussions. So hopefully boards have developed methods to both be secure on um, teleconferences, which I think is becoming the new board meeting, okay, rather than people collecting together. But also, there's discussions now in preparing for virtual annual meetings, communications with the employees. There's all kinds of new challenges as far as communicating about issues. I know that obviously I'm familiar with Diligent. I know Diligent just announced a new secure video conferencing,
Yep.
and there's other portal or solutions companies, but it's very important to make sure that you aren't cutting corners in how you handle these communications at the board level. You just don't want to be the company that's on the front page of the New York Stock Exchange, or I'm sorry, the Wall Street Journal. So that's important. I think that corporate secretaries have to think that through. They have to make sure that they're in a position that directors are able to operate remotely, but still in a secure position. So that would be one of the things that I think is certainly on the radar.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to think about is management teams now are working night and day trying to figure this thing out. And every day they're getting thrown a new curveball, something they hadn't thought about, some new issue that needs to be addressed. So I do think boards need to think about how they're communicating with the management team. And I think the lead director is going to play a really important role over the next couple of months as the, primary liaison, and trying to make sure that he or she stays in communication with all the board members and can sort of rope together all the questions and issues so they go with one communication, to the executive team, because that executive team really time, is going to be a problem for them, and they're very stressed, and this is a health issue, so we want to make sure that we're keeping our executives healthy as well. So that's another element I think boards need to think about. And that maybe brings us to the workforce issue. Just managing a workforce, and I think that's where most companies went from the very beginning, was what's going on with our workforce. We want to keep it healthy and safe, and we want to think about working new ways, like you mentioned, so the whole virtual working. I think most companies did some of that already before, but not on this kind of scale level. So we're all sitting around on pins and needles, hoping that our at home internet connections continue to work, and don't get overloaded. The same thing with companies, thinking about new cyber concerns from either phishing or other concerns, because so many people now are working virtually. And the workforce is also quite fragile. They're very concerned about their jobs. So making sure you are communicating and trying to give them as much of a clear path or transparent discussions as you can around job security and so forth. I think keeping America working right now is a really critical area of focus. And so we're seeing companies do everything they can to make sure that, getting laying off employees is the last possible course of action. And as I mentioned earlier, CEOs are taking pay cuts and so forth. So we'll see how that goes. But your workforce is really your biggest asset, and I see almost all companies really trying to preserve that.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that the number of employees that I've talked to over the last couple weeks that said their company had a fear that with every employee out tapping their system, would their systems hold up?
Yeah.
And that's something, again, that you just wouldn't think of. There will be some interesting results out of this, though, on how companies have learned to operate and realize that they can operate. We may see, some different rules in the office, when all this is done, sort of forced experimentation, if you will, that could be interesting. But for the board and for management, it's with the ESG being pushed, this is and trying not to lay off people. This is certainly one of the social issues of
Hmm.
ESG, which again, there was a little gap between investors and boards and some ESG issues, and this is going to, I think, give a full realization of the kinds of issues that they were talking about as far as treatment of the workforce and making sure that everybody's safe. And just lately, just in the last couple of days, you've seen some of these strikes where people have been asked to come in and they don't feel the conditions are safe
And they're not comfortable, right?
and they're not comfortable with that, which as a management and a board has to be a tremendous challenge. It comes to mind that this is certainly a period where boards are going to earn their pay. It seems
Yes.
like there's an endless number of issues, and that'll sort of morph me into the next one, which is strategy and their brand and goals and targets. Think about how off-putting this is going to be, and the type of meetings that are necessary to say, okay, we don't want to abandon our strategy, but we certainly have to make changes to our strategy. We don't know how long this is going to last. How are we going to what's plan A and what's plan B, depending on the amount of time. Um, and then when you ultimately, this isn't an immediate concern, but ultimately then you have spent all this time on creating these targets for your key employees in the organization, your executive group. Now you've got to make a decision. Okay, do I move those targets? How do I deal with those issues? So all of a sudden, the comp committee has just a load on its shoulders when you think about the workforce. What's going to happen, benefits, and then targets and long-term and short-term bonus issues. So it seems to me that, again, just add that to the pile of issues, and it almost seems like boards are going to be meeting on a very regular basis until we get through this. And we've only touched on really some of the major issues. There's a lot of issues that I think are still bubbling up that, again, people didn't think of initially, but are all of a sudden issues.
They're coming up. Yep, absolutely. There's probably a couple of other ones on my list. Maybe I can throw out a couple of them. One that I didn't mention earlier in the financial discussion, but is around the stimulus bill or the 2020 CARES Act. A lot of companies will be able to benefit from that, but I think boards really need to focus on, first of all, what does that act mean for the company? There's a lot of nuances in there. There's certainly tax benefits and other things, but you need to think about the restrictions with any kind of funding that's provided, repayment terms, and so forth. So that those are fairly complex, and I think will take a certain amount of extra focus from the board to understand all of those nuances. The other thing we're hearing a lot about is supply chain, and how this will forever change the way people think about supply chains. For several years now, people have been very focused on the efficiency of their supply chain and the effectiveness. And we saw even at the beginning of this calendar year, when so many companies relied on China or Asia, and then when they were hit first with COVID-19, we saw some issues over there, and that sort of started some of the problems in the supply chain. But I think supply chain will continue to be a focus, and people thinking about how to make their supply chain more sustainable. Obviously, looking at liquidity of your suppliers and transportation issues and so forth. So there's a lot in that space that are regular operations that have to be addressed. And then last but not least is M&A, right? I mean, you know, no good stock price is going to go unnoticed by an opportunistic person. So we've got, I think we'll have companies as well as activist investors that are opportunistic in their mindset. And I think they're going to be looking out there for good deals. And I think that boards need to try to carve out some time to look around the corner and see what might be coming, given the fact that their stock price might be lower, the value of their company might be more agreeable to someone than it had been in the past, and they need to be prepared.
So I agree with you. We've heard of activists sort of agreeing to sort of a standoff period that are sensitive of what companies are going through. And then we've heard just the opposite, that they are collecting both advocates and stock positions, in a greater way to take advantage of this situation. And it's sad. You would hope everybody would be in the societal, sort of let's help everybody get through this. But there's just some situations where that's not going to be the case, and you have to be
Yep.
sensitive to that. And so, the key to me, it always reminds me of being on an airplane where you're on the tarmac, the plane's not moving. Everybody in the whole plane is wondering what the deal is, and the captain refuses to, update you on what's going on, versus that captain that constantly keeps you, is communicating with you. This in the end is all about good communication, and communicate. And I think that when you do, regardless of what the news is, it's people can deal with it. It's the unknown that is very difficult. So one thing I would say to the board and the management teams is just remember that you almost can't over communicate in this case on what's happening, and it'll help, again, take a issue of concern hopefully away. Employees and companies have enough to worry about without worrying about what's going on in the communication level. So,
Yep.
so Paul, I know you guys at the center have done a lot of work around this COVID-19. Where can people go to tap those resources that are available?
Yeah, I would suggest people go to pwc.com, to our overall website, because there we have been doing a survey of CFOs for the last couple of weeks. We're getting some interesting responses on how they're thinking about and dealing with COVID-19. So it's a good way to kind of see to benchmark what's going on around the country, around the world. We also have a nice risk navigator tool that people can access. It's all free, so you can kind of see how are you doing with the risks related to COVID-19. Are you addressing those? And of course, we have some really good thought leadership there, and we have some stuff coming out for audit committees because, as I mentioned, this is going to be a challenging financial reporting period. So lots of good stuff, but please go to pwc.com, our COVID-19 page.
Well, Paula, thanks for taking the time. And I assume that you're in a home base at this point, but I appreciate you taking the time and joining. Again, this is all about communicating with our audience on anything that we can do to help them get through this very difficult period. So that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed this show. We will be back again very quickly to cover many of the topics that we know are going to be issues for boards and companies in this COVID-19 crisis. So thanks, and we'll see you again very shortly.